Clara Whitfield pressed her palms flat against the wooden counter and did not cry. Not when her stepmother snatched the coins from her hand. Not when Marin laughed. Not even when her father looked straight through her like she was made of smoke. She had learned a long time ago that crying changed nothing in this town. But tonight she found the paper tucked under the flour sack. A ranch posting, 40 miles east. And for the first time in 26 years, Clara Whitfield let herself want something. If this story already has your heart, hit subscribe and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop your city in the comments so I can see just how far this little tale has traveled. The morning Clara Whitfield turned 26, nobody remembered. Her stepmother Constance was already barking orders from the back room before the sun had cleared the ridge. Her half-sister Marin was sitting at the kitchen table painting her nails with the rouge she'd stolen from Clara's dresser again, without apology or acknowledgement. And her father Harold Whitfield was counting coins behind the register of his general store, the way he did every morning, slow and deliberate, like each one was a small prayer answered just for him. Clara had been up since 4. She'd hauled water, swept the storeroom, restocked the grain barrels, and started the bread dough before anyone else had opened their eyes. That was her life. That was how it had always been since her mother died when Clara was 8 years old. And Constance arrived the following spring with Marin on her hip, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Clara!" Constance's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. "The back shelves. Today. Don't make me say it twice." "Yes, ma'am," Clara said, not looking up from the dough. She had learned not to look up. Looking up only invited commentary on her size, on her slowness, on the way she moved, on the space she occupied. Constance had a gift for cruelty that dressed itself up as instruction. She never shouted. She never had to. She had a way of saying Clara that contained everything: disappointment, contempt, the unspoken suggestion that Clara's very existence was a tax on the household. Marin watched Clara cross the kitchen and laughed softly, not at anything in particular, just at the general fact of her. "You've got flour on your dress again," Marin said. "Not that it matters much. Nobody's looking." Clara didn't answer. She picked up the supply crate and walked to the back. The general store sat at the center of Delwood, Kansas, a town that called itself prosperous and meant that a few men had gotten rich while everyone else made do. Harold Whitfield's store was the heartbeat of that arrangement. He extended credit he could afford to call in at any moment, kept records only he understood, and smiled at every customer like he was doing them a personal favor just by existing. In Delwood, Harold Whitfield was a well-regarded man. At home, he was a different creature entirely. He wasn't cruel the way Constance was cruel. He was simply absent-present in the room, but never quite present in the way a father ought to be. He looked at Clara the way a man looks at furniture he'd stopped noticing. She had his eyes, people said, though nobody said it to his face because it seemed to make him uncomfortable. As if the resemblance was an accusation he hadn't asked to answer. After her mother died, there had been a few months, just a few, when Harold had pulled Clara close and told her everything was going to be all right. She had believed him with the whole of her 8-year-old heart. Then Constance arrived, and Harold's grief apparently required someone to manage it for him, and that someone turned out not to be his daughter. Clara was quick. She had always been quick, quicker than Marin at sums, quicker at reading, quicker at learning anything she was allowed to learn, which wasn't much, because Constance believed education made women difficult. But Clara had read every book that passed through that store. She had memorized supply routes, wholesale prices, margin calculations. She ran the inventory in her head faster than Harold ran it on paper. He knew it too. He just never said so. What Harold said every time she made a suggestion was, "Don't make trouble, Clara." What Constance said was, "Who asked you?" What Marin said was, "Why do you even bother?" So by 26, Clara had learned to keep her knowing to herself. She kept it folded up small, tucked somewhere behind her ribs, and she went on hauling and sweeping and restocking and staying invisible, until the afternoon of her birthday, when she found the posting. It had been folded inside a copy of the Wichita newspaper that a traveler had left on the counter and forgotten. Clara had set it aside to read later. She always set newspapers aside to read later, which Constance would have called laziness, and Clara called the only pleasure she had. She unfolded it behind the grain barrels where nobody could see her, and there, tucked among the livestock notices and land advertisements, was a small block of text that stopped her cold. Wanted. One capable woman, honest and hard-working, for domestic management of working cattle ranch outside Millhaven. Cooking household, some livestock familiarity preferred. Wage paid. Inquire J. Lawson, Millhaven, Hartwell County. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it and tucked it into her apron pocket and stood there for a long moment with her hand pressed over it like she was afraid it might disappear. A cattle ranch. 40 miles east, Millhaven was. She'd seen it on the freight manifests. A wage paid. Not room and board in exchange for labor. An actual wage. She told herself it was foolish. She told herself a dozen practical reasons why it wasn't possible. She went back to stocking shelves. She made supper. She served it without complaint when Constance sent back the gravy for being too thin. She washed dishes until her hands were red and the kitchen was dark. And when the house had gone quiet, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the room barely large enough to turn around in, unfolded that newspaper clipping and read it again. Capable, honest, hard-working. She was all 3. Nobody in Delwood would have said so. Or rather, they would have said she was capable and hard-working, and then added something about her size, about her plainness, about the way she took up too much room. But the posting didn't ask about any of that. It asked for someone who could do the work. Clara Whitfield could do the work. She wrote the letter that night by candlelight, her handwriting careful and deliberate, 3 sentences that said everything she needed to say, and nothing she couldn't prove. She said she was experienced with domestic management inventory and basic livestock feeding. She said she was available immediately. She signed her name clearly. She sent it with the morning freight rider before she let herself think too hard about it. The reply came 11 days later. Constance brought the mail in as she always did, which meant she'd already read it. Clara could tell by the way she set it on the counter face down with a kind of deliberate precision that was its own form of theater. "You applied for a job," Constance said. It wasn't a question. Clara picked up the envelope. "Yes, ma'am." "Behind your father's back?" "I didn't think it required his permission." The silence that followed had weight to it. Marin appeared in the doorway from the back room, sensing drama the way she always did, quick and silent and watchful. "You didn't think?" Constance repeated softly. "No, I don't suppose you did. You never do. You just blunder forward. Clara, that's what you do without any consideration for—" "I'm going to read my letter," Clara said. She had never said anything like that before. She wasn't entirely sure where it came from. But she said it, and she meant it, and she turned away from Constance and opened the envelope right there at the counter. "Miss Whitfield, your letter was clear and your qualifications suit. Position is yours if you want it. Wage is $12 a month, room and board included. I'll expect you by the 1st of the month if you're coming. J. Lawson, $12 a month." She had never earned $12 in a year. She had never earned anything. Everything she brought in belonged to the store, to Harold, to the household. She had nothing of her own except a small tin box under her floorboard with $3.40 she'd accumulated over years of careful, invisible saving. "What does it say?" Marin called from the doorway. "It says I have a job," Clara said. "I'm leaving the 1st of the month." The silence this time was different. Constance went very still. Marin's mouth opened, and from behind the register, Harold Whitfield looked up for the first time in what felt like years, and looked at his daughter, actually looked at her with an expression Clara couldn't name. "You can't leave," Constance said. "You have responsibilities here. You have Marin. Marin can't—" Constance caught herself. "Can't do what you do" was what she didn't say. "Can't haul grain and manage inventory and keep this household running without complaint. Can't be used the way you've been used." "This is your home," Constance said instead. "No," Clara said, and her voice was steady. "It isn't." She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket alongside the clipping, and she went back to work, and she said nothing else on the subject. But she was going. She had decided before she'd finished reading the second line. The morning she left Harold was at the register. Clara had her one good bag packed, her $3.40 in her pocket, and her coat over her arm, even though it was full summer, and she wouldn't need it. She had cleaned her room until there was nothing of her left in it. She had made breakfast for the household and left it covered on the stove. She had said nothing to anyone since the night before, when Constance had made one final attempt involving the phrases "ungrateful" and "what will people think," and "you'll come back in a week with your tail between your legs." She stopped at the door. "Goodbye, Papa," she said. Harold looked up. Something moved across his face, something she recognized as regret, though too distant and too late to matter. He opened his mouth. "Don't make a scene," Constance said, appearing from the back. Harold closed his mouth. He looked back down at his register. Clara walked out the door. The freight wagon was waiting at the end of the street. The driver, an older man named Pete Doyle, who had always been kind to her in a gruff, undemonstrative way, held out a hand to help her up. She took it. "Millhaven," Pete said. "Millhaven," she confirmed. She did not look back at the store. She had made a decision she was not going to be the kind of woman who looked back. Millhaven was smaller than Delwood and quieter, which Clara had not expected. It had one main street, a livery, a dry goods counter, a church with a crooked steeple, and a saloon that seemed to conduct more of the town's real business than the church did. It had the look of a place that was either just getting started or just winding down, and Clara couldn't tell which on first arrival. Pete let her off at the edge of town and pointed her east. "Lawson's ranch is about 3 miles that way. You want I can carry you?" "I'll walk," she said. She'd been sitting for 2 hours and her back ached, and she wanted to feel the ground under her feet. She had gone about a mile when she heard the horses, 3 of them coming fast from the north, cutting across the open land toward the road. She stepped to the side instinctively and then stopped because one of the horses was being driven wrong. The rider wasn't in control. The horse was panicking foam at its bit, and the man on its back was low and limp, hanging by grip alone, his hat gone and his shirt dark at the shoulder. The other 2 riders, ranch hands she guessed, young men with scared faces, were trying to flank the panicked horse and couldn't. Without quite thinking about it, Clara put herself in the road. "Hey!" she said, sharp and loud, directly at the panicked horse. "Hey!" The horse skidded, surprised by something standing its ground. She stepped forward just 2 steps, hands out, voice dropping low. "Easy! Easy now!" The horse trembled, snorted, slowed. She caught the bridle. The 2 ranch hands pulled up alongside. "Ma'am," the younger one breathed, staring at her. "He went down in a gully horse, spooked on a rattler. We've been trying to get him back." "Is he hurt?" "Shoulder maybe broke." She looked at the man on the horse properly for the first time. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been out in weather long enough to show at the creases, the sun-darkened skin, the jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. Even half-conscious, and listing badly to one side, there was something in the set of him that suggested he was not a man accustomed to being in this condition. His left hand was still knotted in the horse's mane. His right arm hung wrong. His eyes opened. They were dark gray, unfocused, and then slowly they found her face. "You stopped him," he said. His voice was rough, gravel-edged. "Horse wanted to stop," Clara said. "I just gave him a reason." The man almost smiled. It was a small thing, just a fraction of movement. Then his eyes cleared a little more, and the almost smile went away, replaced by the particular expression of a man trying to assess how much trouble he was in and whether he could hide it. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not," Clara said. "I've had worse." "I don't doubt it. You still need your shoulder looked at." He studied her for a moment, not the way most men studied her, not with that sliding assessment that started at her size and stopped there. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has just done something competent and is trying to work out how. "You, the woman who wrote from Delwood," he said. Clara blinked. "You're Jay Lawson." "Jack?" he said. "Just Jack." He tried to straighten and went gray around the mouth with the effort. "I was coming to meet you in town." "I was walking out to save you the trip," she said. She looked at the two ranch hands. "One of you take his horse, slow. The other ride ahead and get a bed ready and some clean water." The younger one hesitated. "Ma'am, you just got here." "I know. Can you do what I said or not?" They looked at each other. They did what she said. Jack Lawson watched this with the gray still in his face and something new in his eyes that she couldn't name and didn't have time to examine. She took hold of his horse's bridle again and began walking steady, unhurried toward the ranch. "You always give orders like that," Jack said from above her. "When it's necessary," she said. A beat of silence. "Fair enough," said Jack Lawson. Cab. The ranch was not what she had pictured. She had pictured something prosperous, a working cattle operation with the look of success about it. What she found was something that had been prosperous once and was fighting hard to remember how. The barn needed patching. The fence line on the east side had been mended recently and not well. The main house was solid but thin on paint, and the kitchen, which she saw first, had the particular organized chaos of a space where someone capable had once been in charge, and no one capable had been in charge since. She got Jack Lawson off the horse with the help of the older hand, a weathered man who introduced himself as Clem, and who had the quiet efficiency of someone who had been solving problems on this land for a long time. She got him inside and onto the kitchen bench, and cut the shirt away from his shoulder with a kitchen knife, because the alternative was putting him through worse pain, and she cleaned the wound and bound the shoulder tight enough to hold, knowing it needed a real doctor, and saying so plainly. "Doc Hale's in Millhaven Tuesdays and Thursdays," Clem said. "Today's Wednesday," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at Jack, who was sitting with his jaw set and his color slowly returning. "Can you ride tomorrow?" "Can ride now," he said. "You won't," she said. "Not with that shoulder. Tomorrow early someone takes you to Millhaven. Tonight you rest and don't argue about it." He looked at her for a long moment. She waited. "All right," he said finally. It was, she would realize later, the first time in her life, that she had given a direct order to a grown man and had it obeyed without commentary, without negotiation, without someone explaining to her why she didn't understand the situation. Jack Lawson had looked at her and simply said, "All right," as if it had never occurred to him to do otherwise. She turned to Clem. "I'll need a full accounting of the household supplies, the pantry, and the livestock feeding schedule. Whatever's been the routine." "Yes, ma'am." "And my room. Got one ready off the back of the house, small but clean." "Small is fine," she said. She rolled up her sleeves and went to work. By the time the sun went down, she had an inventory in her head, a list of what was needed and what could wait, and a pot of something that actually smelled like food on the stove for the first time, Clem told her quietly, in several weeks. Jack ate without a word. Then he looked across the table at her, with those gray eyes, still doing that thing, that careful measuring thing, that wasn't dismissal, and said, "You're going to be all right here, Miss Whitfield." "Clara," she said. He nodded once. "Clara." Outside, the Kansas summer pressed against the windows, warm and full of cricket sound, and Clara Whitfield sat at a table that wasn't her father's, in a kitchen that might become something that mattered, and felt something shift in her chest, like a door swinging slowly open. She didn't know yet what was on the other side, but for the first time in 26 years, she wanted to find out. Clara learned the ranch the way she learned everything, by watching first, then doing better. The first week was the hardest. Not because the work was beyond her. The work was hard and plentiful and constant. But Clara Whitfield had never in her life been afraid of hard work. What was hard was the adjustment, the particular discomfort of being somewhere new, where the rhythms weren't yet in her bones, where she didn't know which floorboard creaked or how long the well rope needed to drop before it hit water, or which of the hands took their coffee black, and which one would nurse a bitter cup all morning, rather than ask for sugar. She learned. She always learned. Clem was the one who helped her most, though he did it in the way of a man who didn't believe in making a fuss about helping. He would mention things sideways. The east barn door sticks in the heat. You gotta lift and pull at the same time, and then walk away before she could thank him. He was somewhere in his late 50s, had been on this land longer than Jack had owned it, and had the particular loyalty of a man who had decided something was worth staying for, and then stayed through everything without complaint or drama. The other hands were Donnie and Russ. Donnie was 22, eager and slightly afraid of Clara, in the way young men are sometimes afraid of women who know exactly what they're doing. Russ was quieter, older than Donnie, but younger than Clem, and had the watchful quality of a man who had been burned before and was not in any hurry to be burned again. Neither of them was unkind to her. Neither of them quite knew what to make of her. She noticed this and decided not to take it personally. Jack came back from Millhaven on Thursday with his shoulder properly set and bound, and a prescription for rest that he immediately began violating. She caught him in the barn Friday morning with his good arm doing the work of two trying to lift a saddle that had no business being lifted by a man with a freshly set shoulder. "Put that down," she said from the doorway. He didn't startle. She noticed he never startled whatever else he did. He just turned slow and deliberate with the expression of a man who had been caught doing something and was weighing whether to admit it. I know what you were just," she said. She crossed the barn, took the saddle from him with both hands, and hung it on the rack herself. It was heavy. She didn't make anything of that. Doc Hale said 2 weeks. Doc Hale's never run a cattle operation. Doc Hale's never had to reset a shoulder that was re-injured because somebody couldn't wait 2 weeks either, she said. "Sit down, Jack." A beat of silence. Then he sat. She checked the binding, tightened it where it had loosened, and said nothing while she did it. He said nothing either. Outside, one of the horses shifted in its stall, and the summer heat pressed through the barn walls. And somewhere, Donnie was whistling something tuneless and slightly off-key. "You run a household before?" Jack asked. "Ran my father's store and household since I was 8, she said. "Not by choice." "What kind of man lets his daughter run his operation without paying her for it?" She glanced up. It was a direct question, more direct than she'd expected from him. In the 10 days she'd been here, Jack Lawson had turned out to be a man of few words and careful ones. He didn't ask things to make conversation. When he asked something, he wanted to know the answer. "The kind who doesn't notice," she said. "Or tells himself he doesn't." Jack was quiet for a moment. "You angry about it?" "Not anymore," she said, which was mostly true. "I'm here now." He looked at her steadily for another moment, those gray eyes doing their careful work, and then he nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. "You are," he said, "and I'm glad of it." And she finished with the binding and stepped back. "Don't lift anything heavier than a coffee cup for the next 10 days. And if I do, I'll know," she said, "and you'll hear about it." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. She was coming to understand that Jack Lawson's near smiles were a language of their own, each one slightly different, each one meaning something specific. This one meant fair enough, she thought, which was the same thing he'd said to her the first day on the road, which meant maybe it was just how he acknowledged when someone had bested him in an argument, and he didn't mind. She went back to the kitchen, but she was smiling too, just a little, and only where he couldn't see it. That night, she heard him in the main room long after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and she'd banked the kitchen stove. She came out quietly and found him sitting at the table with a ledger open in front of him and a lamp burning low. He looked up. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Neither could I." She pulled out the chair across from him. "What's the ledger?" He hesitated just briefly, just enough for her to notice, and then turned it so she could see. "Ranch accounts." She looked. She had always been quick with numbers, and it only took a minute of scanning before she found the problem. Found it actually wasn't the right word. The problem wasn't hidden. It was right there on the page, obvious and serious, the way a crack in a wall is obvious once you know where to look. "You're short," she said. "Some. More than some." She turned the ledger back toward him and pointed. This column, what's this payment to? His jaw tightened. Landon Pierce. He holds a lien on the south pasture. Since when? Since 2 years ago when the cattle prices dropped and I needed to make payroll. He said it flatly, without self-pity, the way a man states a fact he's made peace with even if he doesn't like it. I've been paying it down, slowly. How much is left on the lien? He told her. She kept her face neutral because he didn't need her alarm on top of his own. But it was more than she'd expected, more than the ranch could comfortably manage on a single good season, and the season hadn't been particularly good. Who is Landon Pierce? She asked. Jack's expression changed. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around the eyes, just a millimeter of something moving behind that steady gray. But she caught it. Biggest landowner in Hartwell County, he said. Has been for 20 years, runs about 8,000 acres north of here. And the lien. Legal, Jack said. Everything Pierce does is legal. He makes sure of it. A pause. He also makes sure that the men who owe him don't forget it. She looked at him carefully. Has he made sure you don't forget it? He's reminded me, Jack said a few times. She wanted to ask more. She could see there was more a layer beneath the surface of those careful words that she didn't have enough context yet to read. But she also recognized the particular stillness of a man who had said what he was going to say for tonight, and no more. All right, she said. She stood up. Get some sleep. We'll look at this again when the feed receipts come in Friday, and I can see the full picture. He looked up at her with that unreadable expression. You don't have to involve yourself in the accounts. That wasn't part of what I hired you for. No, she agreed. But I'm good at it, and you need it, and I'm here. So I will. She moved toward her room, then stopped. Jack? Yeah. Whatever Pierce has over you, it isn't permanent. Numbers are just numbers. There's always another way through them. She went to bed before he could answer. But she lay awake for a long time afterward, staring at the dark ceiling, turning the ledger columns over in her mind. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt something beyond the simple relief of having escaped Delwood. She felt useful, genuinely, specifically, actually useful. It was a feeling she had been waiting 26 years for. The feed receipts came Friday, and they were worse than she'd feared, not catastrophically, but enough. She spread everything on the kitchen table Saturday morning and worked through it with the systematic efficiency she'd developed running Harold's inventory, and by midday, she had a clear picture. The ranch was viable. It was not, however, comfortable, and the lien Pierce held meant there was a ceiling on how much it could breathe. She was still working through it when boots hit the porch steps, heavy, deliberate, not Jack or Clem or any of the hands. She looked up. The man who walked through the door without knocking was tall, well-dressed by the standards of Hartwell County, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and knew it. He was somewhere in his 40s, with the particular ease of a man who had spent so long being the most important person in every room he entered that he'd stopped considering whether that was actually true. He looked at Clara. Then he looked at the ledger, and receipts spread across the table. Then he looked at Clara again, and his mouth curved into something that was shaped like a smile, but wasn't one. Well, he said, Jack hired himself a bookkeeper. Can I help you? Clara said. I'm here for Jack. He's in the north pasture. She didn't move. I can tell him you came by. The man walked further into the kitchen, slow and unhurried, looking around the room with the proprietary ease of someone counting what they consider their own. I'll wait, he said. He pulled out a chair, Jack's chair at the head of the table, and sat down. Landon Pierce, he said as an afterthought. She had already guessed it. Clara Whitfield. You new to Millhaven, new to the ranch, she said. She did not offer more. She had already begun gathering the ledger papers, stacking them with deliberate calm, face down. Pierce watched this with something sharp moving behind his easy expression. Don't mind me, he said. I'm practically family around here. Are you? Jack and I have an arrangement. He leaned back in Jack's chair, comfortable as a man in his own parlor. "I like to check in, make sure things are going well for him." "That's thoughtful of you," Clara said pleasantly. She finished stacking the papers and set them on the far counter out of easy view. "I'll make sure he knows you're here." She went out the back and found Donnie at the fence line and told him to ride to the north pasture and get Jack. Donnie looked at her face and didn't ask questions. He went. When she came back to the kitchen, Pierce was standing at the counter. He'd moved the top 2 papers off her stack and was looking at the one underneath. She crossed the kitchen, took the papers from his hand, and set them back on the pile. He stared at her. She looked at him steadily. "That's private business," she said. Pierce was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man recalibrating. Most people, she sensed, did not do what she'd just done. Most people let Pierce look at what Pierce wanted to look at, because Pierce was who he was, and had the lean, and had the acres, and had 20 years of being the most important man in Hartwell County behind him like a wall. She was not from Hartwell County. "You've got some spine," Pierce said slowly. "Yes, sir," she said. "I do." He smiled, a different smile this time, less easy, more genuine in its unpleasantness. "That can be a problem," he said, "in this county. I'll keep that in mind." They looked at each other for a moment, 2 people, each taking the exact measure of the other, and then Jack's boots hit the porch, and the door opened, and the air in the room changed. Jack looked at Pierce, then at Clara, then at the papers on the counter. Something moved fast across his face. Anger, maybe, or something adjacent to it, controlled and tucked back almost before it arrived. "Landon," he said. "Jack?" Pierce stood, all easy warmth again, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. "Just a neighborly call. Your new woman ran a tight ship. I couldn't get so much as a look at your accounts." He laughed as if this were charming. "Where'd you find her?" "Delwood," Jack said. His voice was even. "What do you need, Landon?" "Just a reminder about the quarterly payment. End of the month." Pierce picked up his hat from the table, she hadn't even seen him set it down, and moved toward the door. He paused and looked at Clara one more time. "Pleasure, Miss Whitfield." "Mr. Pierce," she said. He left. The silence after his boots crossed the porch was heavy and specific. Jack stood in the middle of the kitchen with something still tight in his jaw, and didn't speak for a moment. "Did he touch anything?" Jack finally said. "Tried to look at the accounts," Clara said. "I stopped him." Jack looked at her, then a long, complicated look that she couldn't entirely read. "He's not a man who's used to being stopped," Jack said. "I could tell," she said. "He'll need to get used to it." Another one of those near smiles. This one was different from the others, sharper, and with something in it that looked almost like gratitude, though it wasn't quite that either. "What did you make of him?" Jack asked. "He came to see the accounts," she said. Not to give a quarterly reminder, he knew when the payment was all ready. "He came to see where things stood." She paused. "He wants to know how close to the edge you are." Jack pulled out a chair and sat down. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then, "He's been trying to buy this land for 4 years. And you won't sell. It's my land." "Then we need to get out from under his lien," Clara said. "Because as long as he holds it, he knows the edge and he can push you toward it." Jack looked up. "We," he said. She hadn't noticed the word until he pointed at it. "The ranch," she corrected. "As long as he holds it." Jack was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I had a plan. Before the prices dropped, I was going to—" He stopped, started again. "There's a cattle drive coming through next month. Buyer out of Wichita paying good prices for clean beef. If I can get 200 head to Millhaven before the end of the month, I can make the quarterly payment and have enough left to put a dent in the principal." 200 head, she said. "That's most of your herd." 80 head, he said. "I've got the rest grazing north, but I need to move them fast, and I'm 1 man short. Pierce has been picking off my hands." She stared at him. "Picking them off?" "Offering better wages," Jack said, and his voice was flat and careful. "Legal. Everything Pierce does is legal." He paused. Lost 2 hands last month. Clem and Donnie and Russ, they stayed. But I need at least one more man for the drive. Clara thought for a moment. What does the drive involve? He looked at her the way Donnie sometimes looked at her, with that slight recalibration, that adjustment of where he'd been planning to draw the line. Riding, he said. Long days, hard country. I can ride. Clara. I grew up on the freight routes, she said. I've ridden since I was 10. I'm not claiming to be a cattle hand, but I can ride the flank and keep count and handle a horse in rough ground. You know I can. You saw me on the road the first day. He was quiet. You need a hand, she said. I'm here and I'm willing. What else matters? Jack Lawson looked at her for a long measuring moment, that careful gray-eyed assessment she was beginning to know, and then something settled in him, some decision made visible in the way his shoulders dropped a fraction. We leave at dawn on the 14th, he said. Bring your riding clothes. She nodded. I'll have the provisions packed the night before. She turned back to the accounts on the counter, and behind her she heard Jack exhale slowly, not quite relief, not quite something else. Just the sound of a man who had been carrying something alone for a long time, and had maybe just set a small piece of it down. The days before the drive were fast and full, and Clara moved through them like a woman who had been waiting for exactly this. She reorganized the supply stores, calculated provisions for 5 riders over 4 days, repaired 2 bridles and a saddlebag that had been rotting quietly in the barn. She worked beside Clem in the evenings going over the route, and Clem, who had initially offered her the careful courtesy of a man withholding judgment, gradually shifted into something that looked more like respect. You know cattle, he asked her one evening mending a rope. Some, she said. Enough. Pierce's men have been cutting the fence on the northeast corner, he said without preamble, without drama. Jack knows. I'm telling you because you should know too. She looked at him. How often? 3 times in 2 months. Always small cuts. Enough to let a few head drift, but not enough to be anything you could take to the sheriff. Has Jack reported it? Sheriff Tomlin's a friend of Pierce's, Clem said simply. Not a close friend, but close enough. She filed this away. She was building a picture: Pierce's pressure, the lean, the hands he'd poached, the fence cuts, the quarterly visits. It was patient and calculated and entirely deniable. The strategy of a man who had learned that the most effective pressure is the kind that doesn't leave marks. Thank you, Clem, she said. He nodded, went back to his rope. Figured you'd want to know, he said. You see things. Noticed that pretty quick. She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or simply an observation, but from Clem, she thought it was probably both. On the evening of the 13th, Jack found her in the barn, checking the horses for the drive. He leaned on the stall door and watched her work for a moment without speaking. You don't have to do this, he said finally. The drive, I can find another way. You've had weeks to find another way, she said without stopping. You haven't. Clara. His voice was different, quieter, stripped of its usual careful evenness. She stopped and looked at him. He was looking at her with something open in his face that she hadn't seen there before, something that cost him something to show. I know what Pierce is like with people who get between him and what he wants. I don't... He stopped. I hired you for the household, not for this. You hired me because I was capable, she said. You said so in the letter. I'm capable of this too. He was quiet. Jack, she said, and her voice was gentler now because she could see what this was costing him to say. I know you're trying to protect me. I can see it. And I'm telling you, I don't need protecting. I need the chance to be useful. Those are very different things. He looked at her for a long moment. The barn was warm and close, and outside a nightbird was calling somewhere in the distance. You're not what I expected, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact stated quietly. What did you expect? I don't know, he said. Not you. She held his gaze and waited the way she'd learned to wait with him. He always had more to say when she gave him room. And he did. My wife died 3 years ago, he said. Fever. It was fast. He said it the way he said hard things. Flat, careful. The words coming out like something he'd carried so long they'd worn smooth. I haven't. I'm not used to. He stopped again. Started different. I built this ranch for something, he said. I keep fighting for it because I don't know what else to do. But sometimes I don't remember what it's for anymore. The night bird called again. Somewhere, one of the horses shifted. Clara said carefully and clearly, "It's for the living. Whatever you built it for, then it belongs to the living now. And you're still one of them." He looked at her. She looked back. "Go get some sleep," she said. "We ride at dawn." He pushed off the stall door. Halfway to the barn entrance, he stopped his back to her. "Clara?" he said. "Yeah. I'm glad you came." She turned back to the horse. "Get some sleep, Jack," she said again, but her voice had something warm in it that she let him hear just this once before he walked out into the Kansas night. Dawn came fast and hard, and the five of them, Jack, Clara, Clem, Donnie, and Russ, moved 80 head out of the north pasture before the sun was fully up. It was exactly as hard as Jack had said. The heat came down like something physical by mid-morning, and the cattle were restless, and the ground was dry and cracked, and Donnie lost 3 head in a gully, crossing that cost them 40 minutes getting right. Clara rode the left flank and didn't complain and didn't fall back. When a steer broke toward the brush, she turned her horse fast and cut it off and drove it back, and Russ riding parallel watched this and said nothing, but tilted his hat at her, which from Russ she'd learned was the equivalent of applause. The first night they camped on open ground. Clara made coffee and hard biscuits from the provisions she'd packed, and Clem ate 2 and said they were the best biscuits he'd had on a drive, and Donnie said that wasn't saying much because Clem made the worst biscuits he'd ever tasted. And they argued about this with the affectionate irritation of men who had been working together long enough to love each other without saying so. Jack sat slightly apart eating and watching the herd, and Clara brought him coffee and sat near him without making anything of it, and they were quiet together in the way that was beginning to feel, she thought, like its own kind of conversation. "You did well today," he said. "You sound surprised." "I'm not," he said. And the thing was, he didn't sound surprised. He sounded like a man confirming something he'd already known, which was different and better than the kind of compliment she was used to receiving, which always had an asterisk attached to it. They were one day out from Millhaven when Russ rode in from the south flank at a hard pace that made everyone look up. "Riders coming," Russ said. 6 of them. Pierce's brand on the horses. Jack was on his feet before Russ finished the sentence. "They cutting the herd," Jack said. "Not yet, just riding parallel, watching." "They're counting," Clara said. Everyone looked at her. "They want to know how many head you're bringing in. If they can get the count to the Wichita buyer before you do, and tell him there's a dispute over ownership." "There's no dispute," Jack said sharply. "Doesn't matter," she said. "If Pierce tells the buyer there's a question, the buyer won't risk it. He'll wait, and you'll miss the window." She looked at Jack. "How fast can you get 2 riders to Millhaven ahead of the herd?" Jack looked at Clem. Clem looked at Donnie. "I can ride fast," Donnie said. "Russ," Jack said. Russ nodded once, already turning his horse. "Get to the buyer," Clara said. "Tell him the herd is clean and arriving tomorrow morning, clean bill of sale, no disputes. Get his word before Pierce's men can reach him." "And if Pierce's men ride to cut them off," Jack said. "Then we move the herd now," Clara said. "Tonight. Dark drive faster pace. We get there before morning, and Pierce's men have nothing left to report." She watched Jack work through it. The risk assessment, the calculations, the same quick numbers, thinking she'd recognized in him from the ledger, just applied to a different kind of problem. She'd been right about him. He was smart, and he was capable, and his problem was not intelligence. His problem was that he'd been fighting alone for so long he'd forgotten how to think alongside someone. "We move tonight," Jack said. He looked at her. "You good with a night drive?" "I'm good," she said. He held her gaze for just a moment, that steady gray-eyed look, and something in it was different from all the other times. Not measuring, not calculating, something else quieter and more direct that she felt in her chest like a struck match. Then he turned to the others. "Move the herd," he said. "Now." They moved the herd. They got the herd to Millhaven by 4 in the morning. The town was dark and quiet, and the cattle moved through the empty streets with the low, exhausted sound of animals that had been pushed hard and knew it was nearly over. Clara rode the left flank the whole way, in the same position she'd held since they broke camp the night before, and by the time they got the herd into the stockyard pens, her legs were shaking and her back was a single solid ache from her shoulders to her hips, and she didn't say a word about either. Russ and Donnie had made it. The buyer, a heavy-set man from Wichita named Alderman, who had the look of someone who had been roused from sleep and was trying not to show how much he minded, was waiting at the stockyard gate with a lantern and a bill of sale already drafted. "Clean herd," Alderman said to Jack. 83 head, Jack said. "All healthy, all mine." Alderman looked at the herd, looked at Jack, looked briefly at Clara, in a way that registered mild surprise, and then moved on because Alderman was a practical man who cared about cattle and not much else. "Pierce's man came to see me last night," he said. Jack went still. "And?" "Said there was a question of ownership on some of your stock." Alderman folded the bill of sale. "I told him I'd already given my word to your people here." He nodded at Russ. "I don't go back on my word." The breath Jack let out was slow and controlled, and Clara was probably the only one close enough to hear it. "Appreciate that," Jack said. "Don't appreciate it," Alderman said. "Just do business with me straight, and we won't have problems." He held out the bill of sale. "Sign it." Jack signed it. The money changed hands at sunrise. Clara sat on the stockyard fence and watched and did the arithmetic in her head before Jack had finished counting enough for the quarterly payment, enough for a dent in the principal, enough to breathe for another season. Not enough to be free, but enough. Jack walked over and stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood. "You were right about Pierce," he finally said. "About what he was trying to do." "I know," she said. Then because she wasn't built for false modesty, "You would have figured it out." "Not in time," he said. He looked at her directly. "Not without you." She held his gaze and didn't deflect it this time. "We did it together," she said. "That's all." He nodded slow. That near smile again, but fuller this time, something that almost crossed the line into the real thing. It changed his face in a way she hadn't seen before. Made him look younger, or maybe just less tired. "Let's get the hands some breakfast," he said. "Already told Clem to find the diner," she said. He laughed. It was a short sound rough at the edges, like something that hadn't been used in a while and needed warming up. But it was real. They ate breakfast in Millhaven's one diner. 5 of them, around a table too small, and Donnie talked too much, and Russ said almost nothing, and Clem drank 3 cups of coffee with the focused dedication of a man who had earned every drop, and Jack sat across from Clara, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her that she could not remember the last time she had sat at a table, and simply felt not relieved, not resigned, not invisible, but genuinely present in a place that was becoming slowly and strangely hers. They rode back to the ranch that afternoon. Pierce's men were waiting at the gate. Not 6 this time, just 2. But they were Pierce's men, unmistakably the same horses, the same brand, and one of them was a man Clara had seen in town the week before, big and slack-faced, who Pierce called Harker, and who had the look of a man who enforced things for a living. "Jack?" Harker said, pulling up. "Not Mr. Lawson. Just Jack, with the flattening familiarity of a man reminding you where you stood." "Harker," Jack said, even. "Mr. Pierce wants to talk to you, today." "Mr. Pierce knows where the ranch is," Jack said. "He's welcome to come by." Harker's eyes moved to Clara. Stayed there a beat too long, the particular slow look of a man who wants you to know he's looking, who uses it as a small deliberate pressure. "Got a message for you too, miss," he said. "I'm not your miss," Clara said pleasantly. Harker blinked. Next to him, the other man shifted in his saddle. "Mr. Pierce says you should think carefully, Harker said, about whose business you're putting yourself in. Tell Mr. Pierce, Clara said in the same pleasant voice, that I've thought about it. Tell him it's my business now. She looked at him steadily. Will you remember all that, or should I write it down? The silence was short and sharp. Harker looked at Jack. Jack said nothing. He didn't need to. Harker pulled his horse around, and the two of them rode back toward Pierce's land, without another word. Clara watched them go, and kept her face neutral and her hands loose on the reins, because she knew the kind of men who reported back to the kind of men Pierce was, and she knew that how she looked in this moment would be exactly what got reported. They rode through the gate. When they were out of earshot, Donnie made a sound low in his throat that was approximately an expression of awe. Miss Clara, he said, you are either the bravest woman I ever met or the most reckless. Could be both, Russ said, which was the most words he'd strung together all day. Could be both, Clara agreed. Behind her, Jack said nothing, but she could feel him there, steady and close, and that was enough. The message from Pierce came formally 2 days later. Not Harker. This time, a man in a good suit who rode a good horse and introduced himself as Pierce's attorney, a Mr. Calloway, and who had the smooth, practiced manner of someone who had spent his career delivering bad news in pleasant language. Calloway sat at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee and his papers in order, and said that his client, Mr. Landon Pierce, was exercising his right, under the terms of the existing lien agreement, to call in the full remaining balance due in 30 days. Clara set a cup of coffee in front of Calloway and sat down across from him and said, "Show me the lien document." Calloway looked at Jack. Jack nodded. Calloway produced the document. She read it carefully. All of it, every line, the way Harold had never read his own agreements, and the way Constance had always assumed that legal language was for lawyers and not for women who ran general stores and did the actual accounting. It took her 10 minutes. Calloway waited with the patience of a man who was being paid by the hour. "Page 4, she said, Section 7, subsection C. Calloway looked. Something moved briefly across his face. Not guilt exactly, but the particular expression of a man who knows he's been caught in a precision he hadn't expected to face. "The lien can be called in full," she said, "under the listed conditions. Condition 3 is default on payment. Condition 4 is..." She looked up. "Has Jack defaulted on any payment?" "No," Calloway said carefully. "But, then Condition 3 doesn't apply." She looked back at the document. "Condition 4 is deterioration of the collateral property. Has there been a formal assessment of deterioration?" Mr. Pierce's position is... "That's not what I asked," Clara said. "Has there been a formal assessment filed with the county land office, signed by a registered assessor?" Calloway was quiet. "Because without that," Clara said, "Condition 4 doesn't apply either, and without Conditions 3 or 4 there is no legal basis for a full call-in." She set the document on the table and looked at Calloway directly. "Your client knows this, Mr. Calloway, which means either he's hoping we don't read carefully or he's hoping the threat alone is enough." Calloway picked up his coffee cup, set it down. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and there was something in his voice now that was slightly different, still smooth, still professional, but with a new quality underneath it, something like wariness. "My client is a patient man, but he is not an indefinitely patient man." "That's fine," Clara said. "Neither am I." She stood up. "Tell Mr. Pierce that the quarterly payment was made on time, and the lien terms are being met. If he has a legitimate legal claim, we'll see him in court. If he doesn't..." She picked up the document and handed it back to Calloway. "Then we're done talking." Calloway left. Jack had been standing in the doorway the whole time. When the sound of Calloway's horse faded, he walked to the table and sat down heavily in his chair and put both hands flat on the surface and stared at the wood grain for a moment. "Clara," he said. "Yeah." "Where did you learn to read a lien document like that?" "Harold's store was always in some kind of debt or arrangement," she said. "I read everything that came through because nobody else bothered and somebody had to." She paused. "Also, I have a good memory." "You could have been a lawyer," he said. Women can't be lawyers, she said. That's a damn waste, he said with a sudden quiet vehemence that surprised her. She looked at him. He was still looking at the table jaw set, something burning behind his eyes that wasn't anger at her. It was anger at the particular architecture of a world that took capable people and told them what shape they were allowed to be. Jack, she said gently. He looked up. We're not done with Pierce, she said. That was a test. He wanted to see if we'd fold. We didn't, and now he knows it, and the next thing he tries will be harder. She held his gaze. I need you to tell me everything. Not just the lien. Everything he's done, and everything you know about how he operates. Because I can't help you if I'm working with half the picture. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he might refuse, might retreat back into that careful, self-contained place where he kept the things that hurt. But then he exhaled, and he started talking, and once he started, he didn't stop. Pierce had come to Hartwell County 12 years ago. No one knew exactly where the money had come from. There were stories, none of them provable. Some of them the kind that men told in low voices at the back of saloons. He'd bought land cheap and bought more, and then started buying the debts of the men around him quietly, through intermediaries, until he had his hands in half the county's finances without anyone having quite noticed it happen. 3 ranchers had sold to him in the last 4 years. All of them had held their lien with Pierce. All of them had faced some version of what Jack was facing now. The fence cuts, the poached hands, the manufactured pressure, and all of them had sold at below market value and moved on. One of them, a man named Garrett, who'd had 100 acres north of Millhaven, had tried to hold out. His barn had burned down 6 months later. The fire had been ruled accidental. You think Pierce ordered it? Clara said. I think it's convenient, Jack said. I can't prove anything. Where's Garrett now? Moved his family to Colorado, Jack said. We still write sometimes. He paused. I was the last holdout. Have been for 2 years. Why won't you sell? She asked. Not challenging, genuinely wanting to understand. He was quiet again. My wife and I built this, he said finally. Started with nothing. She picked the land and she picked the house site and she planted the kitchen garden herself the first summer on her hands and knees in the heat. His voice was level, careful, but she could hear what was under it, the weight of it, the love and the grief wound together so tight they'd become a single thing. I'm not giving it to him, Jack said. I won't. She understood then what she was actually dealing with. Not just a ranch, not just a financial arrangement under pressure. A man holding on to the only piece of a life he'd loved that Pierce hadn't been able to take yet. Then we fight, she said simply. He looked at her. It's going to get worse before it gets better. It usually does, she said. That's never been a reason not to fight. Something shifted in his face. Something quiet and fundamental, like a wall coming down one brick at a time. Not all at once, just one brick. Clem said you see things, he said. Clem talks too much, she said. Clem's right, Jack said. He held her gaze. What do you see that I'm missing? She thought about it, about Pierce's strategy patient, and layered about the document, about the fence cuts, about the hands he'd poached, and the quarterly visits, and the things Calloway had not quite said. He's not trying to break you financially, she said. Not primarily. He could have done that already if the lien terms let him, and they don't. You've been too careful. What he's doing is isolating you. Taking the people around you, cutting your resources, making sure that every time something goes wrong, you're more alone than you were before. She paused. The ranchers who sold, did they all have families? Jack frowned. Garrett had a wife and kids. Simmons was widowed. Burke had a partner. Garrett had the most to protect, she said, and he held out longest. She looked at Jack. You've been alone for 3 years. Pierce has been betting on that. He figures a man alone eventually gets tired, gets scared for himself with nobody else to be scared for. She paused. He didn't count on you hiring. Jack absorbed this slowly. He came to look at the accounts, he said, that first day. He was measuring the ranch, seeing if you'd brought in someone competent or just someone cheap. She met his eyes. I think we startled him. Good, Jack said with a quiet heat she'd never heard in his voice before. It means he'll move faster, she said. So we need to move faster too. She stood up. I want to write to Garrett in Colorado. Jack stared at her. Garrett. He had the same lean structure. If Pierce used the same tactics on him, the fence cuts the pressure. The hands, then there's a pattern. A pattern is evidence. She looked at him. Is there a land registry office in Millhaven? Hartwell County records are kept there, Jack said slowly. Then I need to get in there and look at the other transfers. Simmons and Burke, when they sold, was it recorded as voluntary? As far as I know. As far as anyone knows, she said, because that's what Pierce wants everyone to know. But if I can find the original lien documents for all three ranchers and compare the terms, if he used the same trigger, the same pressure, the same manufactured default? She stopped. Jack, if the pattern is clear enough, it's not just your problem anymore. It's fraud. He was very still. I need to go to the county records office, she said. And I need to go without anyone who looks like they're connected to your ranch. Pierce has eyes in Millhaven, Jack said. I know, she said. That's why I'm going alone. He stood up fast. Clara, I'm a woman going to a county office to look at public records, she said. There's nothing unusual about that. A man with your brand on his horse draws attention. I draw. She paused, and something moved across her face that was honest and unsentimental. I draw a different kind of attention. The kind where people don't think I'm worth watching. He looked at her, and the thing that moved through his eyes in that moment was complicated anger at the truth of what she'd said, and something else underneath it that she wasn't ready to name yet. I don't like it, he said. You don't have to like it, she said. It's just true. She went to Millhaven 3 days later alone on the older bay horse that didn't carry Jack's brand. She wore her plainest dress and her most unremarkable hat, and she walked into the Hartwell County Records office at 9 in the morning with a list of names and the steady, concentrated expression of a woman who knew exactly how to make herself invisible when she needed to. The clerk was a thin young man named Hessler, who looked at her with vague disinterest and told her the land transfer records were public access, and pointed her toward the back wall. She spent 4 hours in that office. What she found was worse than she'd expected, and better than she'd feared, which was a specific combination that she'd learned to recognize as the shape of actionable information. The lien documents for Garrett, Simmons, and Burke were all there. All three used nearly identical language, nearly, but not quite identical, which meant they'd been drafted to look independent while following the same template. All three had been called in under Condition 4, the deterioration clause, with assessments signed by the same registered assessor, a man named Howell, who, when she checked the assessor registry, had been licensed in Hartwell County for 9 years, and whose license had been issued in the same month that Pierce had arrived in the county. She sat with that for a moment. Howell's license, Pierce's arrival, same month. She wrote everything down in her small, careful handwriting. Every document number, every date, every signature. She wrote the name Howell 3 times and underlined it twice and put a question mark next to the license date. When she walked out of the records office, Harker was standing across the street. He wasn't doing anything, just standing the way a man stands when he wants you to know he's watching without doing anything you could object to. He looked at her and tipped his hat slow and deliberate. She looked back. She did not change her pace. She rode home with her notes folded small inside her boot, her heart moving faster than she let her face show. And when she turned through the ranch gate, she found Jack waiting at the barn. Not because he'd been watching for her, she thought, but because he'd been unable to make himself not. "How'd it go?" he said. She dismounted and handed him the reins and said, "Get Clem. I need to tell both of you at the same time." His jaw tightened. "That good or that bad?" "Both," she said. She told them at the kitchen table. All of it, the documents. The identical language, the assessor. Howell, the license date, the pattern laid out clear as columns in a ledger. Clem listened with his coffee and his still careful face, and Jack listened with his hands flat on the table and his eyes moving between her face and the notes she'd spread out, and the kitchen was very quiet. When she finished, Clem said, "Howell. He assessed the Garrett property." "You knew him," Clara said. "Knew of him," Clem said. "He's Pierce's brother-in-law." The silence landed hard. "That's not in any public record," Jack said slowly. "It wouldn't be," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but her mind was moving fast. "It doesn't need to be. It's a connection, not a transaction. But if we can establish the connection and show the pattern—" She looked at Jack. "We need a lawyer, not Calloway. Someone independent." "Nearest independent attorney is in Wichita," Jack said. "Then we write to Wichita," she said. Jack looked at the notes. He picked up the page with Howell's name and the license date and held it for a moment. "If Pierce finds out we have this," he said, "before we can do anything with it." "I know," she said. "Harker saw you leave the records office." "I know that too." He set the paper down. "How long do we have?" "Days," she said. "Maybe less." She looked at him squarely. "Jack, we need to move on this fast, and we need to protect the ranch while we do. He's going to push harder now." And Pierce pushed harder that same night. Clara woke to Clem's fist on her door at 2 in the morning and his voice low and urgent saying, "Miss Clara, get up." She was dressed and out the door in 60 seconds. Clem was already moving and she followed him, and she smelled it before she saw it. Smoke thick and specific, the particular wrong smell of burning wood that shouldn't be burning. The east barn. Not the whole thing, not yet. A corner of the roof small and vicious. The kind of fire that had been set and was working its way inward with the particular efficiency of a fire that had been helped. Jack was already there, and Donnie and Russ with a water barrel on a handcart. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the bucket line with Donnie and they worked it fast and hard. Clara's arms burning her throat, filling with smoke and the fire resisting, and then slowly agonizingly giving way. They put it out in 40 minutes. The corner of the roof was gone blackened and open, and 3 stalls were damaged. None of the horses were hurt. Jack had gotten the horses out first. She'd learned that about him, she realized, without knowing she was learning it. He always got the vulnerable things clear before he dealt with anything else. When it was done, they stood in the yard, all 5 of them smoke-stained and breathing hard. Clara's hands were shaking slightly, and she closed them into fists and let them shake. "This wasn't an accident," Russ said. "Not a question." "No," Jack said. He was looking at the damaged roof jaw set, and his voice was so controlled it had gone almost flat. "No, it wasn't." Donnie started to say something. Jack held up one hand, and Donnie went quiet. Jack turned and looked at Clara. His face was tight and hard, and there was something in it she hadn't seen before. Not defeat, not even anger exactly, but the look of a man who had just watched a line get crossed that he'd been hoping wouldn't get crossed. "He burned Garrett's barn," Jack said very quietly. "I know," she said. "I thought—" He stopped. "I thought if we moved fast enough, if we had the documents." "We still have the documents," she said. "He didn't get those. He got wood and shingles." She held his gaze. "Jack, this is what he does when he's scared. This is what it looks like when he knows someone's getting close." The tightness in Jack's face shifted, just slightly. "The letter to Wichita goes tomorrow," she said. "Tonight," he said. "It goes tonight." "Tonight," she agreed. They wrote it together at the kitchen table, while the others watched the yard. Jack's handwriting and Clara's precise organization of the facts, the dates, the names, the connections. 3 pages clear and specific and damning. When it was done, Jack folded it and sealed it and handed it to Clara, and she held it and looked at him. "This is enough," he said. "It's enough to get a lawyer interested," she said. "Whether it's enough for court?" She paused. "We need Garrett. His testimony about how the pressure was applied, about Howell's assessment on his property. I'll write to Garrett tonight, too. Tell him the truth," she said. "All of it. Tell him what Pierce did to you and what we found, and that we're not asking him to fight just to tell what happened to him." She looked at Jack steadily. People who've been bullied into silence usually want to speak. They just need to know they won't be speaking alone. Jack looked at her for a long moment in the smoky, lantern-lit kitchen, and the thing that was in his eyes now, she'd been avoiding naming it for days, carefully, deliberately, because she was not a woman who let herself want things she wasn't sure of. But in this moment, at 2:30 in the morning, with the smell of smoke in her hair, and his handwriting next to hers on the page between them, she let herself see it for what it was. He reached out and covered her hand with his, just for a moment. Just briefly, his rough, smoke-stained hand over hers on the table. "What would I have done," he said quietly, "if you hadn't answered that posting?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She turned her hand over under his just for a moment, and then she stood up and said, "I'll ride to the post first thing. You should sleep." She walked to her room and closed the door and stood with her back against it in the dark and breathed. Outside somewhere on Pierce's land, someone was watching the smoke clear from the east barn, counting it as a warning delivered. But inside this ranch, something was building that was harder to burn than wood. Clara pressed her palm flat against the door and felt her own heartbeat. They were not done. They were, in fact, just beginning. The letter to Wichita went out on the early morning rider, and the letter to Garrett went with it, and Clara rode back from the post office with the particular hollow feeling of someone who has done the only thing they could do and now has to wait to find out if it was enough. Waiting was harder than working. She had always known that about herself. She threw the energy into the ranch, fixing the damaged barn corner with Clem reorganizing the supply stores, calculating what the cattle sale proceeds could cover, and in what order. Jack worked beside her through most of it quieter than usual, with the particular focused stillness of a man who was holding himself together through motion. She understood that. She didn't push him to talk. But on the third morning after the fire, he found her at the kitchen table before dawn with her notes spread out and said without preamble, "Pierce came to see me yesterday afternoon, while you were at the barn." She looked up. "What did he say?" Jack pulled out a chair and sat. "He said the fire was a tragedy, said he hoped we were all right." His voice was flat and careful in the way that meant he was controlling something underneath it. "Said he'd be willing to take the ranch off my hands at a fair price given the circumstances. Said it was a genuine offer out of neighborly concern." "What did you say?" "I told him I wasn't selling." Jack looked at his hands on the table. "He said, and I'm giving you his exact words, he said, 'Jack, I've been patient with you. I won't be patient much longer, and I'd hate for the people around you to suffer for a decision that's yours to make.'" The kitchen was very quiet. "He threatened the hands," Clara said. "He threatened everyone," Jack said, without saying a name or making a statement that could be used against him. He looked up at her. "He's good at it." "He mentioned me," she said. It wasn't a question. Jack's jaw tightened. "He said a woman alone in a county where she has no family and no standing ought to be careful about making enemies." A pause. "I told him to get off my land." "Good." "Clara." His voice dropped. "I need you to understand what he's capable of." "I understand it fine," she said. "Garrett's barn burned with his animals inside," Jack said. "He lost 2 horses and his milk cow, and it took him 3 days to get his wife to stop shaking." He held her gaze. "That's what we're dealing with. That's who this man is." She held his gaze right back. "I know," she said. "And I'm still here. I'm not leaving." Something moved across his face, relief and anguish in equal measure. The expression of a man who wants someone to stay, and is afraid of what staying might cost them. "You should be able to make that choice freely," he said. "Not because you feel obligated. Not because you've got nowhere else to go." "I have somewhere else to go," she said, and it was true, and they both knew it. She'd proven in the last 2 months that she was capable of landing on her feet in most circumstances. "I'm here because I want to be. Because this ranch and these people matter to me." She paused. "Because you matter to me. That's a free choice, Jack. I'm making it." He was very still. The early light was coming through the kitchen window, thin and pale, and outside, Clem was moving around the yard with his coffee, the way he always did at first light. "All right," Jack said. His voice was rough at the edges. "All right." She turned back to her notes. "Then let's talk about what comes next, because Pierce is going to move before our letter reaches Wichita." She was right. He moved 4 days later. Harker arrived at the ranch mid-morning with 4 other men, not hired ranch hands this time, but the county sheriff's deputy, a man named Briggs, who had Pierce's ease about him, and Pierce's eyes, the eyes of someone who knew exactly who was paying attention. Clara was in the yard when they rode in. She didn't move. "We're looking for Jack Lawson," Briggs said. "He's in the barn," she said. "What's this about?" "Got a complaint filed," Briggs said. "Property damage. Mr. Pierce says cattle from this ranch broke his north fence line and damaged his feed stores." The specific audacity of it hit her so hard she almost laughed. Almost. "When?" she said. "3 nights ago." 3 nights ago, every person on this ranch was awake putting out a fire on our own property, she said, which I imagine someone failed to mention in Mr. Pierce's complaint. Briggs looked at her with the patient blank expression of a man who had been told what to say and wasn't interested in what she was saying back. "I'll need to speak with Mr. Lawson." Jack came out of the barn, Clem behind him. He took one look at Briggs and Harker, and his face went carefully neutral, that controlled stillness she'd come to recognize as Jack at his most dangerous when he was working hardest to keep himself level. "Deputy," he said. Briggs explained the complaint. Jack listened without interrupting. When Briggs finished, Jack said, "My cattle didn't break any fence. My cattle are all accounted for. My ranch was dealing with a fire that night." "Can you prove that?" Briggs said. 4 people were here," Jack said. 5 counting Miss Whitfield. "Mr. Pierce has 2 witnesses who say different," Briggs said. "Of course he does," Clara thought. "I'll need to take a look at your herd," Briggs said. "Make sure the numbers match." Jack looked at Clara. She gave him the smallest nod, just barely, just enough. "Go ahead," Jack said. Briggs and 2 of Pierce's men walked toward the pasture. Harker stayed in the yard watching Clara with that deliberate, weighted attention he'd been using since the first day she'd sent him away empty-handed. "You've been busy," Harker said. "Heard you visited the county records office." "Public records," she said. "Anyone can look." He tilted his head. "Mr. Pierce is a man who notices things. Who's looking what they're looking at, how often they write letters." She kept her face entirely smooth. "I write a lot of letters," she said. "I was raised to keep in touch with people." Harker studied her. "Who'd you write to in Wichita?" "A friend," she said. "What kind of friend?" "The kind who writes back," she said. Harker held her gaze for another moment, measuring, pressing, looking for the crack. She gave him nothing. Briggs came back from the pasture with his count, and it matched Jack's numbers exactly, and there was nothing Briggs could formally do, which he seemed to find mildly inconvenient, but not surprising, and the party rode out without another word. When they were gone, Donnie let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding the entire time. "What happens when they come back?" he said. "They will come back," Jack said. "With something else. Something harder to answer." He was looking at Clara when he said it, and she was already thinking. The answer came from an unexpected direction, the way the best answers often did. Garrett's reply arrived 11 days after they'd sent the letter. Clara recognized the handwriting on the envelope as careful and slightly cramped, the writing of a man who didn't write often, but who, when he did, meant every word. She brought it to Jack, and they read it together at the kitchen table. Garrett had not forgotten. That was clear from the first line. He had in fact been waiting, not quite consciously, but in the way that wronged people wait, with a patience that is really just suppressed fury, looking for somewhere to go. He confirmed everything. The lean language, nearly identical to Jack's. Howell's assessment filed 14 days before Pierce's formal call-in. The fence cuts. The poached hands. The offer at below market value. And one more thing. One thing Clara had not known, and had not been able to get from the county records because it had never been officially recorded anywhere. When Garrett had refused to sell, Pierce had gone to Garrett's wife directly, had told her that Garrett's stubbornness was putting their children at risk, had implied carefully, never stated that accidents happened to families who made the wrong enemies. Mrs. Garrett had told her husband what Pierce said, and Garrett, who was a good man and a brave man, but a man with 3 children and a wife he loved more than land, had sold, below market at Pierce's price within the week. Clara set the letter down. "He intimidated a woman and her children," she said. Her voice was quiet and completely level. "To get to her husband." Jack's hand was flat on the table. His knuckles were white. "I want Pierce in a courtroom," Clara said. "I want every one of those families to get what he took from them. And I want to make sure he cannot do this to anyone else." She looked at Jack. Garrett's testimony, plus the document pattern, plus Howell's connection to Pierce, that's a fraud case. That's a real one. "If we can get a lawyer to take it," Jack said. "We already sent to Wichita," she said. "But Jack, we need more than a civil case. What Pierce did to Mrs. Garrett." She paused. "That's intimidation. In some jurisdictions, that's criminal." "Sheriff Tomlin isn't our sheriff," she said. "But there's a territorial marshal's office." She looked at him steadily. "Clem mentioned it. You never pursued it." "I didn't have evidence," Jack said. "You do now," she said. He looked at Garrett's letter, then at her. "You want to go above Tomlin. I want to go straight to the people Pierce can't buy," she said. "If he's been working Hartwell County for 12 years, and Tomlin's been sheriff for 10 of them, Tomlin knows where his bread is buttered. But a territorial marshal answers to nobody in this county." "That's a significant step," Jack said. "If we go to the marshal and it doesn't stick, it'll stick," she said. "If we do it right." She pulled Garrett's letter toward her. "I need you to trust me on this." He looked at her for a long moment. Not the measuring look he'd stopped measuring her weeks ago. This was something different. The look of a man deciding how much of himself to put in someone else's hands. "I trust you," he said. Simply. Completely. The word landed in her chest like something warm and solid. "Good," she said, and got to work. The response from the Wichita attorney arrived 2 days later, a man named Aldrich, whose letter was brief and professionally cautious, but whose final paragraph said he had reviewed similar land fraud patterns in 2 other Kansas counties, and would be willing to travel to Millhaven to review the documents in person. Clara read that paragraph 3 times. She showed it to Jack and watched his face change, the slow release of something he'd been holding under pressure for so long, she thought he might have forgotten what it felt like to let it go. "He's coming," Jack said. "In 10 days, she said. "We need to have everything organized. Every document, every date, every connection. Garrett's letter, the records copies I made." She paused. "And we need Garrett here if possible. In person is better than a letter." "I'll write to him again." "Ask him to bring his wife," Clara said. Her testimony about Pierce's visit is the most damning piece of this. A man threatening a woman and her children in her own home, that's not business. That's criminal. Jack was already moving to the desk. He wrote the letter fast, with the decisive energy of a man who finally had something concrete to do with all the anger he'd been managing for 2 years. Clara organized the documents in the order Aldrich would need to see them, and made 3 copies of everything in her careful, precise hand, because she had learned that important things should always exist in more than one place. Pierce struck again before Aldrich arrived. She supposed she'd expected it. This time, it wasn't the fence or the barn or the hands. Pierce was smarter than that, he'd understood. She thought that physical pressure was only hardening them. This time, he went for the community. She found out from Widow Haskell at the dry goods counter in Millhaven, a small, sharp-eyed woman who had lived in Hartwell County for 40 years and who had no particular fondness for Pierce and no particular reason to hide it. "He's been talking," Widow Haskell said, wrapping Clara's flower with quick, efficient movements. "Pierce, telling people your man Lawson is behind on his obligations, going to lose the ranch, don't extend him credit." She glanced up. "Telling people you're—" She stopped. Telling people what about me, Clara said. Widow Haskell met her eyes directly, woman to woman. That you're not what you appear to be, she said. That a woman alone taking up residence on a single man's ranch, well, he's not saying anything outright. He doesn't have to. Clara absorbed this without letting it show on her face. The specific cruelty of it was efficient and familiar. She recognized it as the same weapon Constance had used, the same one small towns used against women who didn't fit neatly into the shape they were supposed to occupy. Who's listening? She said. Some, Widow Haskell said. Not all. Folks around here have seen what Pierce does. Some of them don't need much convincing to look the other way, sure. But some of them are tired of looking the other way. She paused. That's what I'd count on if I were you. Clara bought her flour and her sugar, and on the way out, she stopped and turned back. Mrs. Haskell, has Pierce ever put pressure on you? The widow's expression shifted into something dry and knowing. Tried to buy this store 6 years ago, she said, when my husband died, offered me 30 cents on the dollar and told me I couldn't run it myself. She smiled a small, sharp thing. I've been running it myself for 6 years. Would you be willing to speak with an attorney from Wichita? Clara said, about Pierce's business practices, in general terms. Widow Haskell looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once, the decisive nod of someone who has been waiting for this specific question for approximately 6 years. I would, she said. Clara walked back to the horse with her supplies, and the particular feeling warm and electric, and slightly terrifying of something beginning to gather momentum. She told Jack that night. All of it, Pierce's rumors. Widow Haskell's offer the shape of the community that Pierce had been systematically intimidating for over a decade, and that was, she thought, reaching the limits of its tolerance. He attacked your reputation, Jack said, and his voice had gone very quiet. He attacked what he thought would hurt, she said. He was wrong about what hurts me. She looked at Jack steadily. But I need you to know what he's saying. Because when Aldrich arrives, people in Millhaven will have opinions about why I'm involved in this. You should be prepared for that. Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up from his chair and walked to the kitchen window and stood there with his back to her, and she waited because she had learned to wait with him, and he always had more to say. Clara, he said without turning, I want to ask you something. All right, she said. He turned. His face was open in the way it only got late at night when the day's work was done, and the careful control he wore like a second skin had eased. When this is over, he said, when the lawyers come and gone and Pierce is dealt with one way or another, what do you want? She looked at him. What do I want? For yourself, he said. Not for the ranch, not for the case. You. He held her gaze. You came here with $3.40 and a letter that said you were capable. That was 2 months ago. You've been so busy holding everything together that I don't think I've ever asked you what you're holding it together for. The question sat in the air between them, and she realized with a small jolt that nobody had ever asked her that. Not once in 26 years. Constance had told her what she was for. Harold had assumed it. Even the posting had said what the ranch needed, not what she might. I want to stay, she said. The words came out simpler than she'd planned, stripped of all the qualification she usually wrapped around the things she actually meant. I want to be somewhere that needs what I have, and doesn't. I want to be somewhere real. She stopped, started again. I want this. Whatever this is turning into. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stopped in front of her, closed the closest he'd stood since the first day on the road when she'd caught his horse, and his eyes were doing the thing that wasn't measuring anymore, the thing she'd been not naming for weeks. I want to ask you to stay, he said. Permanently, not as an employee. He paused. As a partner. In the ranch. He stopped, and something in his face was young and uncertain, in a way she hadn't seen before, in a way that cost him something to show. In my life, if that's something you want. The kitchen was so quiet, she could hear her own heartbeat. Jack Lawson, she said, are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking you what you think of the idea, he said, because you always have thoughts, and I'd like to hear them before I make a fool of myself. She looked at him. This man who had hired her for her competence, and argued with her when she was right, and listened when she spoke, and held her hand in a smoky kitchen at 2 a.m, and never once, not one single time in 2 months, made her feel like she took up too much room. "My thought," she said, "is yes." He exhaled. Long and slow and genuine, the breath of a man setting down something heavy he'd been afraid to put down. He took her hands. His were rough and warm and certain. "The ranch is half yours," he said. "However this turns out with Pierce, I want that in writing before the lawyer leaves." "That's very practical for a marriage proposal," she said. "I'm a practical man." "You are," she agreed. "It's one of the things I like about you." Outside, the Kansas summer pressed against the windows, and the ranch was quiet and standing damaged in one corner. But standing and somewhere on a rider heading north was a letter to a territorial marshal's office that neither of them had spoken aloud yet as the thing that might actually end this. Clara Whitfield held the hands of a man who had chosen her on purpose clearly, without asterisks, and thought about what it meant to be wanted, not in spite of yourself, but because of yourself. It was, she thought, worth every mile from Delwood. Aldrich arrived on a Tuesday 3 days ahead of when he'd said he would. Clara was at the kitchen table when she heard the horse, and she went to the door. And there he was, a compact, serious man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a travel bag that looked like it had seen the inside of a lot of county courthouses. He introduced himself with a handshake that was brief and firm, and he looked at her the way she'd learned to appreciate being looked at, which was the way people look at someone they're assessing professionally, rather than personally. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "your letter was the most organized piece of correspondence I've received in 11 years of practice." "Mrs. Lawson," she said, "as of last week." Aldrich blinked once adjusted and moved on. He was that kind of man. "Congratulations," he said briskly. "Is your husband available?" Jack came from the barn, and they sat at the kitchen table, all three of them, and Clara laid out the documents in the order she'd prepared: the lien papers, the records copies, the assessor registry, Howell's license date, Garrett's letter, her written account of every incident from the fence, cuts to the barn fire, to Harker at the records office, to Pierce's visit to Mrs. Garrett. Everything in sequence, everything dated, everything cross-referenced. Aldrich read without speaking. He read the way she read, thoroughly, not performing thoroughness, but actually doing it, going back to earlier pages when something on a later one required it. He spent 12 minutes on Garrett's letter alone. When he finished, he took off his glasses and set them on the table and looked at the documents spread in front of him and was quiet for a moment. "This assessor," he said. "Howell, Pierce's brother-in-law," Jack said. "We can't prove it through county records, but we have a witness who knew them both before Pierce came to the county." "Widow Haskell," Clara said. "She'll speak to you directly." Aldrich put his glasses back on. "The barn fire," he said. "No witnesses to the ignition." "No," Jack said. "But the fire marshal, Tomlin's man," Clara said. "He ruled it accidental." She paused. "But I spoke to the blacksmith in Millhaven who was up that night with a sick horse. He saw 2 riders on the road to our east barn at around midnight. He didn't come forward because—" She stopped. "Because of Pierce," Aldrich said. "Because of Pierce," she confirmed. "But he told me. And he'll tell you if you ask him directly, and he believes something will actually come of it." Aldrich looked at her steadily. "You've been busy, Mrs. Lawson." "I have been," she agreed. "How many people in Millhaven do you believe are willing to speak?" "6 that I've spoken to directly," she said. "Widow Haskell, the blacksmith. 2 ranchers who declined Pierce's offers, but watched what happened to the ones who didn't. The feed store owner, who Pierce pressured out of extending Jack credit, and the post office clerk who received specific instructions from Harker about flagging Jack's mail." She held Aldrich's gaze. That last one made the clerk uncomfortable enough that he remembered every detail. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "The mail interference," he said. "That's federal." "Yes," she said. "I know." Jack looked at her. She hadn't told him about the post office clerk yet. There hadn't been a calm moment to do it in. He looked at her with an expression that was approximately, "Of course you found that," and approximately, "We are going to talk about this later," and she gave him the smallest nod that said, "Yes, we are." "I came early," Aldrich said, "because I received a separate inquiry 2 days after your letter arrived, from the Territorial Marshal's office." The kitchen went very still. "They'd received a complaint," Aldrich said. "Anonymous. About land fraud practices in Hartwell County." He looked at Clara. "Would you know anything about that?" She held his gaze. "I wrote to them," she said, 3 weeks ago." Jack turned to look at her fully. "I didn't tell you," she said to Jack directly, "because I didn't know if it would come to anything, and I didn't want to give you hope that evaporated. I should have told you anyway. I'm sorry." He looked at her for a moment. His jaw was tight. Then he exhaled. "All right," he said. She turned back to Aldrich. "What did the marshal's office say?" "They've been building a file on Pierce for 8 months, Aldrich said, "independent of anything to do with this ranch. Land consolidation patterns across 3 counties. They needed a direct victim willing to testify and a lawyer willing to take the case." He paused. "Your letter combined with the marshal's inquiry gave me both." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before Donnie, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway for the last 5 minutes without anyone noticing, said, "Hot damn," and then clapped his hand over his mouth and looked at Clara. "Language," she said automatically. Then she looked at Aldrich. "What do we do next?" Garrett arrived 2 days later with his wife Ellen and their youngest child, a girl of about 7, who regarded the ranch with the serious curiosity of a child who had been told this trip was important and had decided to treat it accordingly. Ellen Garrett was a small woman with steady hands and the particular kind of quiet that comes not from timidity, but from having survived something and come out the other side of it, knowing exactly what she was made of. She shook Clara's hand at the door and looked at her and said, "You're the one who wrote to my husband." "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. "Good," Ellen said. "It was time somebody did." Aldrich spoke with Garrett for 2 hours in the main room, while Ellen sat at the kitchen table with Clara and drank coffee and talked in the direct, unornamented way of 2 women who have both been through enough to be done with pretense. Ellen told Clara about the night Pierce had come to the house, not Harker Pierce himself, in his good suit, with that easy smile that wasn't one. How he'd sat across from her while her husband was in the Southfield and told her quietly and pleasantly that a woman with children had to think carefully about the future. How he'd picked up her youngest daughter's rag doll from the chair beside him and set it on the table between them and left it there the entire conversation. How she'd understood exactly what he meant, and how she'd been shaking so badly by the time he wrote out that she'd had to sit down on the floor. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. When Ellen finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Will you tell that to Aldrich?" Clara asked. "I will tell it to anyone who needs to hear it," Ellen said. "Under oath if it comes to that." Clara reached across the table and covered Ellen's hand with hers for a moment. The same gesture Jack had made to her in the smoke-filled kitchen. She realized the gesture of one person telling another, "I see what this cost you, and I am not going to let it be for nothing." "It will come to that," Clara said. "And I'll be right there when it does." Pierce moved the morning after Garrett arrived. Clara heard the horses before she was fully awake, more than 2, this time more than 4. She was dressed in 60 seconds and out the door in 90, and what she found was Pierce himself, which was new. Pierce on horseback, with Harker beside him, and 6 men she didn't recognize, and the county sheriff Tomlin, who had the look of a man who knew he was on the wrong side of something and had decided to be there anyway. Jack was already in the yard. Clem was behind him. Garrett had come to the door of the bunkhouse they'd put him and Ellen in Donnie and Russ's room, and Ellen was in the doorway behind him with her hand on his arm. Pierce looked at Garrett for a long moment, and something cold moved through his expression and then smoothed out again into that easy, terrible pleasantness. "Jack," Pierce said, "I've been patient." "You said that before," Jack said. "I'm saying it again because I mean it differently now." Pierce looked around the yard at Clara and Garrett at the ranch. I'm here to take possession of the property under the default clause of the lien agreement. I have paperwork signed by Judge Hendricks. Judge Hendricks is in Pierce's pocket, Clem said quietly to Clara. She was already moving not a way forward. She walked to the front and stood beside Jack and looked up at Pierce on his horse. Show me the paperwork, she said. Pierce looked at her. The pleasantness slipped just for a moment, just enough. This is between me and Jack. Jack is my husband, she said. This property is half mine. Show me the paperwork. Tomlin produced the document. She took it and read it standing in the yard with Pierce's horse 2 feet from her and 6 men she didn't know watching, and she read every word the same way she'd read every other document in this fight thoroughly, without performance actually doing it. This cites Condition 4, she said. Deterioration of collateral property. The fire damage to the east barn, Pierce said. The fire that your men set. Jack said, his voice very quiet and very controlled. Careful, Pierce said, and there was something under the pleasantness, now something hard. That's an accusation. There's a witness, Clara said. She looked up from the document. A blacksmith in Millhaven who saw 2 riders on the road to our east barn at midnight on the night of the fire. His statement is currently in the possession of a lawyer from Wichita and a representative of the Territorial Marshal's Office. She held Pierce's gaze. This document is invalid because the condition it cites was manufactured, and the assessor who would be called to verify the deterioration is your brother-in-law, which is a conflict of interest that will be presented in full to the territorial court. The yard was absolutely silent. Pierce looked at her. She had seen him in various states, the easy neighbor, the pleasant threat, the patient predator, but she had not seen this before. This was a man who had just discovered that the ground under him was not as solid as he'd believed. Territorial Court, he said carefully. The Marshal's office has been building a file for 8 months, she said, across 3 counties. The men who sold to you are being contacted. Mrs. Garrett has agreed to give testimony about your visit to her home. She paused. The mail interference, Mr. Pierce, is a federal matter. That's not my jurisdiction or Tomlin's. That belongs to people you cannot buy. Tomlin shifted on his horse. Pierce did not look at him. This document, Clara said and held it up, is being filed as evidence of attempted fraudulent possession. If you'd like to leave the premises, I'll tell Mr. Aldrich that you cooperated. Harker's hand moved toward his belt. Jack moved at exactly the same moment 1 step forward between Clara and Harker, and his hand was steady, and his eyes were on Harker with the complete still attention of a man who will not move and knows it. Don't, Jack said. 1 word. Absolute. Harker stopped. The standoff lasted 10 seconds. They were the longest 10 seconds Clara had experienced since she'd stood in her father's kitchen and said, I'm leaving. Then Pierce pulled his horse around. This isn't finished, he said. No, Clara said. It isn't. Not until the territorial court says it is. Pierce rode out. His men followed. Tomlin went last, and as he passed Clara, he looked at her with the expression of a man who had just watched the wind change and was trying to work out if he could change with it. The gate closed behind them. Donnie made a sound that was approximately a whoop, caught Clara's eye, and converted it into a dignified cough. Russ sat down on the porch steps as if his legs had decided for him. Clem walked to the water pump and filled a cup and drank it with the focused deliberateness of a man restoring himself to equilibrium. Garrett walked across the yard and shook Jack's hand. Then he looked at Clara. When my wife and I sold, he said, I thought that was the end of it. I thought we'd just disappear and Pierce would go on and nobody would ever make it right. His voice was rough. Thank you for not letting that be true. She didn't have the right words for that, so she just nodded, and he seemed to understand. Ellen put her arm around her husband's waist and looked at Clara over his shoulder and said quietly, You're a remarkable woman. I'm a practical one, Clara said. Remarkable is something else. Ellen smiled a full, real smile, the first one Clara had seen from her. That's exactly what makes you remarkable, she said. The territorial marshal arrived in Millhaven 6 days later. He was a tall, unhurried man named Weston, who wore his authority like a well-fitted coat, and who sat in Aldrich's borrowed office and went through every document Clara had assembled with the same methodical care she'd used to assemble them. He interviewed Garrett Ellen Widow Haskell, the blacksmith, the post office clerk, and 4 other witnesses that Clara had identified and Aldrich had prepared. He interviewed Clara last, alone without Jack, which she'd expected and was ready for. He asked her to describe every interaction she'd had with Pierce and his men, every document she'd found, every conversation she'd recorded. She described them in order clearly without dramatization with dates and specifics. He listened and made notes and asked precise follow-up questions, and at the end, he looked at her across the desk and said, "How long have you been in Hartwell County, Mrs. Lawson?" "Just under 3 months," she said. He looked at his notes. "You built this entire case in 3 months." "I had the documents," she said, "and the people. They were all waiting. They just needed someone to ask the right questions and take the answers seriously." Weston regarded her for a moment. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "I've been told that," she said. He smiled, brief, precise. "Pierce will be formally charged within the month. Land fraud across 3 counties, mail interference, and we're looking seriously at the arson." He closed his notebook. "The lien on the Lawson property will be voided as an instrument of fraud pending the outcome. Your deed is clean." She sat with that for a moment. "The deed is clean. The other families," she said. "Garrett Simmons Burke, the land they sold." Weston's expression was careful. "That's more complicated," he said. "The sales were recorded as voluntary. Recovering land that has changed hands is a different legal matter from the criminal charges." He paused. "It may be possible with the fraud finding to file civil suits for compensation. It's not guaranteed. But possible." "Possible," he confirmed. She nodded. It was not everything. It was not the clean, complete justice that the part of her trained on right and wrong wanted. But it was real, and it was more than Pierce had counted on, and it was a beginning. She walked out of Aldrich's office into the Millhaven street, and Jack was there leaning against the post outside waiting. He looked at her face. "Well," he said. "He's being charged," she said. "Lien is voided. Deed is ours clean." Jack was quiet for a moment. He looked at the street, at the ordinary afternoon business of a small Kansas town going about its life, and she watched something move through him. Not joy, exactly, not relief exactly, but the particular settling of a man who has been braced for impact for so long that when the impact doesn't come, he has to remember how to stand normally. Then he put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her against him and held her there on the street in plain sight of anyone in Millhaven who cared to look, and she let herself be held fully and without apology because she had stopped being apologetic about the space she occupied somewhere between Delwood and here. "The deed is ours," he said quietly, not a question. "Ours," she confirmed. "Both names. I checked with Aldrich before Weston arrived." She felt him laugh, that short, rough, real laugh she'd come to love, the one that still sounded like something warming up after a long cold. "You checked with the lawyer before the marshal even finished the interview," he said. "I'm a practical woman," she said. "You are," he said. "God, you are." The ride back to the ranch was easy and unhurried, the 2 of them on the road in the late afternoon heat. And Clara thought about Delwood, not with grief, not with the particular ache of someone looking back at a wound, but with the clear, settled distance of someone who has moved far enough forward that the past is simply the past. Harold at his register. Constance with her cold eyes. Marin and her borrowed rouge. The narrow room. The flower-covered dress. The $3.40 in a tin box under a floorboard. The newspaper clipping folded in an apron pocket. Capable, honest, hard-working. She had been all 3 before she walked into this county. But she had not known until this county what those things could build when they were actually given room. Pierce was arrested 17 days later. Harker turned county's evidence inside the first week. Harker, it turned out, was not a man of deep loyalty, which surprised no one and disappointed no one. The arson charge was added to the fraud and the mail interference, and Howell's assessor license was revoked by the state, and Judge Hendricks resigned before the formal inquiry into his conduct could go further, which was its own kind of confession. Tomlin lasted another month before the county voted him out and replaced him with a man named Carver, who had no debts to anyone and said so plainly on his first day in office. Clara wrote to Garrett with every development. Ellen wrote back long, specific letters, the letters of a woman who had found someone she trusted to tell the truth to, and the two of them kept up a correspondence that had nothing to do with Pierce and everything to do with what came next. Ellen and Garrett filed the civil suit with Aldrich's help. So did Simmons's widow. Burke, who had moved to New Mexico, came back to file his. The cases moved slowly the way civil cases did, but they moved. Widow Haskell put a notice in the Millhaven paper about what had happened. She didn't need to ask anyone's permission because it was her paper. She'd bought it off a man who'd tried to sell her a half share, and she'd told him she wanted all of it or nothing. The notice was precise and factual, and it named names, and it was the talk of Hartwell County for 3 weeks. Clara read it at the kitchen table and felt for the first time in the long arc of this fight something that was simply and cleanly satisfaction. She still made the bread before dawn. She still kept the accounts, which were now genuinely healthy for the first time since the prices had dropped. They'd paid off the lien with the voiding, plus the cattle proceeds, and Jack had negotiated a second Wichita sale that had put them on solid ground. She still rode the fence line and managed the household and did half the work that some people thought was too much for a woman her size. In the summer heat, and she did it without apology and without explanation because she had never needed to explain her own competence to herself. But the ranch was different now. She felt it in the way Clem moved through it with the ease of someone who has stopped waiting for the next blow. She felt it in Donnie's ridiculous cheerfulness and Russ's slightly less silent silence. She felt it in the kitchen garden that she'd started in the south corner of the house on her hands and knees in the heat the way Jack's wife had once planted hers. Jack had stood in this doorway the first morning she'd started it and watched her without speaking for a long time. "You don't have to do that," he'd said finally. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to." He'd come out and crouched beside her, and they'd worked the ground together without talking much. The good kind of quiet between two people who have run out of things to prove to each other. He found her one evening in late summer, sitting on the porch with Garrett's latest letter and a cup of coffee she'd let go cold. He sat beside her, and she handed him the letter without comment, and he read it and handed it back. "They got a partial settlement," he said. "Enough to lease back 40 acres north of town," she said. "It's not what they had, but it's something." "It's something," he agreed. They sat in the quiet for a while. Inside, she could hear Clem and Donnie arguing about something with the warm, frictionless ease of people who liked each other. And somewhere on the south pasture, the cattle moved in the last light, and the Kansas summer laid its heavy hand on everything, and the world went on. "You know what I've been thinking about," Jack said. "Tell me." "You," he said. "Sitting in your father's store, reading that newspaper clipping behind the grain barrels." He looked at her. "What would have happened if you hadn't sent the letter?" She thought about it honestly. "I'd have found another way out eventually," she said. "I was always going to leave. The posting just—" She paused. "It gave me a direction." "I'm glad it pointed here," he said. She looked at him. This man she'd chosen, and who had chosen her clearly and specifically, and on purpose, the way she'd always wanted to be chosen. The man who had looked at what she was capable of and called it an asset, and never once tried to shrink it to fit a smaller space. "So am I," she said. He took her hand. She let him. The deed to the Lawson Ranch sat in the top drawer of the kitchen desk, both names on it witnessed and filed and clean. The kitchen garden was coming up in the south corner. The east barn was repaired better than before. Clem said which he meant as a fact, and Clara took as something more. The accounts were in order. The herd was healthy. The land was theirs, and Clara Whitfield, Clara Lawson. Now, though she kept both names in her own head, because you don't shed the self that survived, just because the surviving is over. Clara sat on the porch of a ranch that she had helped save and helped build and helped make into something worth fighting for. And she did not look back at Delwood. She had arrived with $3.40 a tin trunk and the absolute conviction that she was worth more than the room she'd been given. She had been right. She was home.